Welcome, race boat fans from all over the world. Welcome to Champions Park Lake Studio. I'm your host, Dana Potts, also promoter of Wake the Lake 5 and also the promoter for Champions Park Lake. Excited for tonight's show. We got a special guest. But before we get into the show, I want to thank our sponsors. Besser Health came on board. Go to getbesser.com. We got that on. Let me see if I can get it in the camera. Go and get your shield, your support immune system shot. Go and get that. They're big supporters of our show. We thank them every week. Also, a shout out to Flow Sports and Flow Racing. They are now our official broadcast company for Champions Park Lake, and we'll be broadcasting all our races. We got people chiming in already, which is great. Feel free to ask questions. I'll see if I can get them up on board as we dive into our guests. Some news to share. They had the APBA OPC meetings last week, the Outboard Performance Craft. I myself was awarded the Outstanding Achievement for 2020. I want to thank Bill Gore, chairman, and also the commission for awarding me that. That was a great honor, and thank all my staff for everything we did this past year. And also, we were awarded the OPC Nationals. So Champions Park Lake is going to have, we're the only facility to ever host two separate category nationals in one calendar year. So we have the APBA Stock Outboard Nationals, Stock Mod and Junior Nationals, and that's July 12th through the 18th. And we have the OPC Nationals, which will be August 6th through the 8th. So if you're looking for outboard racing this summer, you need to make your way to Champions Park Lake, which, without further ado, I think this guy, our guest, is going to be a little excited about outboard racing. I want to welcome our guest, Director of Engineering for Mercury Racing, Jeff Broman. Welcome, Jeff.
Thanks, Dana. Thanks for having me on.
Excellent. So I always start off with this question. How did you get involved in boat racing or with Mercury Racing?
Yeah, I think my way into racing has been a little bit almost backwards of probably your usual guest. I started out in the mainstream marine industry, and that's where I spent most of my early career, and just recently got into the racing side of things. So I grew up in Fond du Lac. Both my parents worked at Mercury, so it was something I was exposed to since I was a little kid. Boating was something we always did in the summertime. You know, it was a goal to always get on the boat on the weekend. Mm-hmm. So I went to school at the University of Wisconsin, got my mechanical engineering degree there, and then right out of school, I applied for and got a job at Mercury, working in engineering. I started out in our engine thermodynamics group, which that group is responsible for all of our calibration, our performance development, combustion, emissions, fuel economy, that kind of stuff. And so I worked on V6 two-strokes right out of the gate, a lot of Optis, EFIs, that kind of stuff. Then progressed into the six-cylinder Verado, and then mostly four-strokes from there on out. The different Verado kind of developments and generations after that. And then in 2010, I switched jobs a little bit, and I became a technical manager at Mercury. So a technical manager is like a lead project engineer. So first project I led as a TM was the 115 four-stroke engine that we launched in 2014. And then right after that engine launched, I got the opportunity to take over the V6 V8 project that had just gotten started just before that. So I worked on that project then. That engine launched, the first stage of it launched at the Miami Boat Show in 2018. That's when we launched the V6. And then the V8 and some of the other versions followed after that. So during that project is when, early on in that project, it became pretty clear that the V8 would make a really good replacement for the 300XS Optimax that racing was selling at the time. So that's when Eric Christensen and I started working and kind of comparing notes on that and framing out what that project would look like. And we started running that project, which became obviously the 300R. That project ran in parallel with the mainline project. And then a little bit later, Dave Folks, who was the VP of engineering at the time, he's now the CEO of Brunswick. He challenged us and said, "Hey, you guys got to put a supercharger on the V8," which at the time just sounded insane. I was like, "No way, that's never going to work. We're never going to package that. That's crazy." Well, he was right. He's a pretty darn good engineer. And obviously that's what became the 450R. So that was another project we ran in parallel. So through all that, I started getting really exposed to racing and the guys there. And during that time, then Eric approached me and said, "Hey, once this project's done, we have an opportunity for you at racing." And so I jumped at that. And then so right after we launched the V6, I moved over to racing. So I've been there just under 3 years now as director of engineering. We got the 450 into production, the 300R into production. Been working on lots of cool stuff just in that short amount of time. And obviously, probably of most interest to the folks tuning in tonight is the 360 Apex project. So the new Formula One engine that we just launched. That's been really exciting, and that's been a really fun project.
So tell us a little bit about how this, because it sounds like you guys are working in kind of the bigger boats and stuff like this, and now all of a sudden you transition into this project focused on a V8 and sticking a V8 on a tunnel boat, and working on that. How did that all come about? And how did that all come about? That's kind of crazy. Because we hadn't had a V8 on the back of a tunnel boat in a while.
Yeah, I think obviously by the late 2000 teens, the two-stroke engines that are in Formula One and even Formula 2 and what you're running in the different classes here in the US they're getting a little long in the tooth, and it's really not a technology that is almost relevant to Mercury Marine anymore. The consumer marketplace has completely moved to the 4 strokes, and that's where all the development work is happening now. So to make a good race engine for tunnel boat, we have to start with a production platform that can kind of be the donor, right? We can't just do a custom engine for tunnel boat racing. It's just going to be too expensive for us to develop it and for us to sell it. So there has to be some sort of production engine that we can start with. And I think early on in the V8 project, that light bulb went on for me, is saying, we looked at the 6-cylinder supercharged engine, the Verado, years ago for Formula One, and it's too heavy, it's too big. It wasn't going to work. But this V8, that might have a shot. And so again, that Eric and I had kind of bounced some ideas off of each other early on, and said, this might actually have some potential. And we talked about whether we try and use some hardware from the 400 ROS to combine with the V8. How much of the current F1 engine we could use? Could we use the clamp bracket assembly? Could we use the gear case? Those sorts of things. So it seemed like it had a chance. And then when I come over to racing, obviously I didn't have the background in tunnel boat racing. I needed to talk to some experts. So that's when I reached out to Chris Fairchild. I reached out to Fred Hollenstein. I started talking to those guys and said, "Hey, we've got this idea. First of all, are we crazy, or is this thing, does this actually have a chance?" And then, they agreed that, there's some potential here. So they started feeding us the information we needed to really understand the details of what the requirements are. And that's, that's something I learned through years of doing product development at Mercury. Is the key to doing a good product is really getting your customer requirements up front, really well detailed, understanding exactly what the product's got to deliver. And that's Fred and Chris helped out so much with that at the beginning. So that kind of helped us frame up the concept. And then the fall of 2018, I went to my first UIM General Assembly. That was in Beirut that year. And in the Formula One committee meeting there, we pitched the idea. And it was a really good forum because we obviously had the UIM folks there, and Fred was there, so he could help kind of guide us and shepherd us through that. But we also had F1H2O there. So Nicolo, Lavinia, Alec, they were all there. And then we had a couple of reps from the teams and drivers. So Sammy Celio and Merritt Stromae were there as well. So we were able to get feedback from everybody all at the same time. And the feedback was really positive. They said, we think this is something the sport needs. We need to move toward a 4-stroke. We need something that, can bring us into a kind of the modern era.
Mhm.
and this thing looks like it's got legs. So that was when we really got serious about it. So early 2019, we were still mostly working on getting the 450 across the finish line. We launched the 450 in, I think it was June or July of 2019.
Mhm.
So we're a little bit resource constrained first working on the project, but once we got the 450 finished and out the door, that's when we could really focus on the V8. So that's where that project really started getting going. And
Mhm.
we could do a lot of the performance development stuff on the engine side, just on conventional midsections. We didn't need the short midsection for that. So all of our dyno development, all of our software work, that all could happen right away as we were designing the midsection. And then once we got the midsection design, we built a prototype, and then Chris helped us out with actually driving it and testing it and giving us all the feedback on, this is what works, this is what needs to be improved, and
Mhm.
that process kept going. And then the original plan for the engine was we were going to launch it at the Dubai Boat Show, which was going to be
Oh.
in March of 2020,
Mhm.
about 4 weeks, I think, after Miami Boat Show.
Mhm.
And I remember going to the Miami Boat Show, which is in the middle of February, and talking to
Yeah.
folks there. And we started talking about this thing that was happening in Italy. And, there's this virus and people are getting sick. And man, I wonder what that's going to do. Having no idea of, couldn't have, in our wildest dreams, have imagined what was actually going to happen. Right. So
Yeah.
just in a couple of weeks, everything blew up. So
Yeah.
we were going to launch at Dubai. Dubai got canceled. I had plane tickets booked to go to Saudi Arabia because, like, 2 weeks after the Dubai Boat Show was the first F1 race
Mhm.
in Saudi, and I was going to give them a big technical presentation and teach them about the engine and all this stuff. That race got canceled, so that didn't happen.
Mhm.
And then in the second F1 race was going to be in Portugal in
Yep.
May, and the plan was in place for us to show up with a half a dozen engines, and they were going to have the race, and then that whole next week everybody was going to stick around, all the teams, all the safety crews,
Mm.
everything, and we were going to have all these engines, and people could rig them on their boats and they could go run them. We were going to do service training and show you how to work on the engine and blah
Nice.
blah blah, all this stuff.
Yeah.
And poof, so this disappeared. So obviously things turned out a little differently, and
Yeah.
2020 was a challenge in a million different
In
ways.
itself, yes. We've got our first question tonight
Yeah.
from Frank Dodge. Is Mercury going to make race engines for kneel down boats again?
Yeah, that's interesting question. That kind of comes at the whole other end of the product
Mm.
line, right?
Yeah.
And I think you had a week or two ago, and you
Mm.
had Pavliks were on the show
Yep.
talking about some of the work. So we took a production 20 horse four stroke. I
Mhm.
gave that to Chris, and guys have been playing with that, trying to get that to work. So that's a different, it's a totally different animal. Again, it's the same kind of thing where we're transitioning from an old two stroke to a newer four stroke. There's going to
Mhm.
be some challenges. It's not going to be a drop in simple replacement. There's going to need to be some work, but I think that's starting.
Mhm.
And if you look over in Europe, there's a couple of runabout classes, GT15, GT30, that are like the youth classes where people
Mhm.
are getting their start. Those have transitioned to four stroke over the last few years, and there were some teething pains, and there was some work to get those developed, but they got there. And
Mhm.
yeah, I'm hoping we can start doing some of the same stuff here in the States.
Excellent. Excellent. Feel free to chime in, ask your questions tonight, guys. We've got Jeff here. He's willing to answer anything. He said he
Almost
wouldn't.
anything.
He said he wouldn't plead the fifth on most of the questions. So
Most. Thank you.
um, I'm going to dive into a question. I mean, we talked about the V8, and last year was pretty much thrown up in the air.
Yeah.
Is there any thoughts? Is there, the V8 is really good fit for F1 H2O. Do you guys have any plans for racing in the States for
Yeah.
Champions Park Lake and tunnel boats on this? Because the boats that we run over here, a little less horsepower, a little more competitive. I tell my fans it's like IndyCar versus F1. F1 super fast cars. IndyCar is super fast cars too, but it's very competitive in my standard. So, is there any plans for the States?
Yeah. So If you look at what we did with the V8, that was yeah, you're absolutely right. We're targeting kind of the big dog, the top tier F1H2O, which is the most challenging application to go after.
Mm-hmm.
So the thought process was, if we can make something work there, then we've got a platform to work from to look at for these other series,
Mm-hmm.
for the US, for Formula 2, stuff where people are running either the 200XS Optimax or SST 120 or something kind of in that flavor.
Mm-hmm.
So not ready to reveal all the details about that yet, but yes, we are working on that. We have something that is really close that we're going to be ready to talk about here, probably in the next couple of months. We're just working out the final details of how that's going to roll out. But yeah,
Nice.
we have something that is queued up for the next level of tunnel boat racing.
Well, I know a race lake where you could race it at. Yeah,
Do you
I
now?
know one. Just
Do
give me
you?
a ring.
So
Get me
far,
going.
it's all been Lake X so far, but yeah, we're
Wait,
ready to
wait,
branch out.
here. I'm gonna be my marketing. Lake X builds champions. Champions Park Lake crowns them.
There you go.
There we go. We got another question coming in from Andrew Gagooch. Does the 360 APX meet the same emission regulations as the consumer 300R? Obviously, the noise levels are different with the racing mid, but are the emissions the same in regards to engine calibration?
Yeah.
And
So
I didn't get his whole. Yeah, that was his question.
okay. Well, the short answer, yeah, they are the same. So if you're familiar with what the standards in the U.S., 3-star is what they call the lowest emissions regulation level for outboards that are sold in the U.S. That's that regulation started with California, and then
Mm-hmm.
EPA has adopted it as well. So it's a 50-state standard. So that's what we certify. Basically, all of Mercury's 4-stroke engines are certified to 3-star.
Mm-hmm.
Including the 300R. The 360 Apex meets basically the same levels. So yeah, it meets the 3-star standard.
Mm-hmm.
Europe has a slightly different set of rules. The numbers end up coming out about the same. They call theirs the RCD, and we meet their standard as well. So we meet worldwide. We meet the lowest emission standards for outboard engines with the 360 Apex, which that's something like 90% reduction from where the conventional 2-strokes are.
Mm. Nice. So on this whole project of putting a V8 on a tunnel boat, what was a challenge that came up that you were like, wow, I didn't know about this? Or like, when Chris Fairchild went out and ripped it in the corner, you were like, I wasn't expecting that. What was the biggest thing that threw you guys off? Or because you were somewhat new to this. You hadn't really sat and really digested what a tunnel boat can do.
I think probably one of the ones that comes to mind for us, we knew it was going to be a challenge, but we didn't really know how much. We didn't know how we were going to attack it really at the beginning. Was a lube system, right? So 2-stroke, it's premix. You don't have to worry about it.
Mm-hmm.
But 4-stroke, obviously, you've got this lubrication system. High-end race cars or the 400 ROS use dry sump systems. So the oil comes down into some sort of reservoir. There's a scavenge pump that pulls the oil out of the engine, out of the reservoir, puts it in a remote tank. Gets basically a good supply of oil, and then you bring that oil back into the high pressure pump and pressurize the engine. That we could have approached the 360 that way, but we didn't want to because it adds a lot of complexity to the boat. You've got to have this remote tank. You have to have a scavenge pump. You have to have all this plumbing. You put all the heat from the oil into the boat. It's kind of a pain to have this remote dry sump system. We really wanted to do a wet sump like a normal outboard where you just have a reservoir underneath the power head that the oil falls down into. That's fine when you're going in a straight line, but when you go into a corner, these tunnel boats can pull 4, 5, maybe 6 Gs. It's an incredible cornering force. And if you had so if you have your glass of water here, right? So
Hmm.
that flat surface under normal 1G going down, with 6Gs going sideways, this surface goes to like an 80, 85-degree angle.
Hmm.
So the challenge there was the oil wants to stay in the power head then. It doesn't want to drain back down to the sump. And then if you've got a sump, and you put a pickup in the middle of it, well, all the oil goes to one side. Now the pickup's just sucking air.
Yeah.
So that was a real challenge. We came up with a number of different baffling systems to try and address that. We actually came up with some computer simulation models that we'd never had done before, really, at Mercury. It was kind of cool to try
Hmm.
and simulate the motion of the oil inside the sump and how it moved around.
Nice.
And we went through a bunch of iterations of how to develop both a system that keeps the oil from hanging in the power head and then a pickup that would always pick up oil. Um, if you just go around in a circle, you could just put the pickup on one side. But then, the second you put a right hand turn in the course, now you're going to starve it. Or if you go to Rouen, where Rouen's always run right-handers, then you got to put a
Yeah.
different pickup in. So we wanted to have something that would work regardless of the course.
Hmm.
That was a challenge, and that took us a little while to figure out. But we came up with a pretty clever system with a series of trapdoors underneath the power head to keep the oil from running back up into the power head, and then
Hmm.
a pickup that's kind of a T-shaped pickup with a shuttle valve in the middle that slides to one side or the other and biases the pickup to whichever side the oil is on.
Hmm.
So that was probably the biggest technical challenge. It took us a while to sort that out, but
Nice.
after the last version of that we had, and we had Chris run around the lake and make corners as hard as he could. Never saw a drop in oil pressure, so ended up getting that system pretty well dialed in, and we're pretty happy with how it works now.
Excellent. We got another question, John Sobel. You might have to plead the fifth on this one. Is it rumored that Mercury may have bought Evinrude's tooling? And
I'm not
I'm
a,
not sure what tooling he's referring to,
I know
because.
there was a maybe you're referring. I know they put they had an auction down in Florida, maybe just a
Hmm.
few months ago. I think in Stewart, where they had their test facility, and they were
Hmm.
auctioning off a whole bunch of equipment from there. Short answer is no. We've never really picked up any of the tooling or any of the equipment from Evinrude.
You're 4 cycles. Don't want any of that 2 cycle stuff.
Yeah, and even in the two cycle world, they had their FICT, which evolved into eTech.
Hmm.
And we had the Optimax system, which goes back to the old orbital designs from the 80s and 90s. Even in the two-stroke world, we were on totally different paths. So no, there really wasn't much cross-pollination, and we didn't really pick up any of the pieces after they exited the marine market.
So with the change of the world last year, and you're not able to roll a lot of things out, what are you guys' plans for? Because we had Jonathan Jones on here. He was
Mhm.
asking, boat
Yeah.
builders, when's the opportunity for them to get their hands on the V8 and maybe test it and feel
Yep.
it? And all these guys have questions. So do you guys have a plan right now?
We do, and it's the plan. I don't know, DEF. I don't know. We're falling so far down the list of backup plans. After last year. So I think if you've paid attention to social media, you probably saw that around I think early November last year. DAC, Guido Cappellini and the Abu Dhabi team, they bought an engine.
Yeah.
So they have an engine in Abu Dhabi. They've started running it. I don't think they've run it since the holidays. A lot of the players from the team went back to Italy for the
Hmm.
holidays, and they haven't started back up yet. So they're starting to run and starting to learn a little bit. We're also working on getting another boat set up with another team to be used as more of like a community test boat where all the teams can come and test it out. So I've been working with one of the teams in Europe. We're probably shipping engines over next week, actually, and gathering up all the rigging hardware and everything else. They're going to get the boat rigged, and there's a Mercury racing dealer in Belgium that's going to help facilitate testing. So hopefully in the next couple of months here, we'll be able to get some more, people in a boat with the V8 on it, get drivers in the seat, and get them starting to experience it and really understanding what are the differences and how is it how are they going to use this thing and how are they going to develop it going forward. it's been a challenge getting the message out there about the new engine with everything being on lockdown has been a real challenge. It's been, kind of frustrating, but we're playing the long game here. We know it's going to take a little while, but that's okay. We're just going to have to roll with it.
I'm surprised I'm not getting some basic questions. So I'm just going to ask them bluntly. What speeds are you seeing with this thing? What kind of performance are you seeing
Sure.
with this compared to? Because you're trying to live up to an S3000. I mean, that's a stout motor that
Oh yeah.
tough to beat. 2-cycle. I mean, you're talking a 20-year-old motor that's been honed pretty well. So
Yeah.
what kind of performance numbers are you seeing?
Yeah, I mean, so you say that the S3000. I mean, that goes back to the original small V6 platform that came out in the late 70s. I mean, that thing has been around. It's been polished and polished and polished, and a bunch of really smart people, guys like Fred, have spent a lot of time refining that thing. It is it is probably the best two-stroke engine that's ever been produced.
Yeah.
Period. Like it's an amazing engine.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's a super high bar for us to try and chase. So the other trick is, we don't have a wealth of current S3000 engines sitting around at Mercury Racing. I mean, we stopped producing that engine in like 2005, and then all these other independent engine builders, these guys have been polishing it and refining it for the last 15 years. So even if I had something that we had built, it's really not representative of what people are running today. So what we use as our point of reference is we basically replicated one of the current F1 courses at Lake X. So we laid out the course exactly like the China course that they ran in 2019. And then we had a data log from one of the boats running in that race that we could look at, and we could compare lap times, we could compare accelerations and top speeds. So that was really the way that we gauged where the V8 stands versus the current S3000 F1 engine. So what I can say is, from a performance standpoint, so we're running our boat. Our latest test boat is a 2009 DAC. So it's about 10 years behind what the current F1 guys are running. And when we tested at the lake, in general, our goal wasn't like, how fast can we get this thing? Our goal was, let's put hours on it and make sure we don't have problems. Let's make sure that everything works. We don't have anything breaking on us. We've got a reliable engine. That's really what we were shooting for. So when we would go down the lake with our boat, not a lot of setup time. We didn't really work on honing everything in. We didn't have a pile of props there to really dial everything in. With that said, within a couple of days, we were turning equivalent lap times to what the current engine's getting, and our top speeds are probably about 10 miles an hour faster than the two-stroke on the equivalent course.
Wow, that's awesome.
So I think it gives us a lot of headroom. There's a lot of room to develop. There's a lot of room to dial in. The potential is there.
We got another question coming in from Brooke B. I'm going to try to decipher this. He says, "Is there any difference between the SSM4 that came with the S3000 and the SSM4 that comes with the 360 APX?"
Yeah, that's a really good question. So very little difference. So and in fact, we're going to have a kit available that you can convert a current two-stroke version of the SSM4 to the four-stroke version. So they're that close. So the key difference is the input shaft. So the SSM4 on the two-stroke, obviously the input shaft runs all the way up to the crankshaft. On the 360, there's an overdrive in between the crankshaft and the gear case. And that's so we basically step up the speed, step down the torque to match the input speed to the gear case that the two-stroke's getting today. So what that means is the input shaft to the gear case now is just this little stub shaft. It's a couple inches long, 3 inches long. The other thing that's different is the top cover where the shaft goes in, which on the two-stroke and holds the water pump. So you've got the water pump housing the little discharge port. That goes away. The water pump is actually in the overdrive on the 360 Apex. So where the water pump and that top cover and the bearing retainer is, that's just a flat plate V8 version. Other than that, the housing shape is identical. The guts are identical to the S3000 version, the left hand in, left hand out version, not the 200XS version where it's right hand in, left hand out. So yeah, they can be converted. They're very, very similar.
Great. He did have a follow-up question. Can you expand on changing gear ratios in the gear case? And David also chimed in. He said, can you explain how the variable ratio drive works on the 360 APX?
Yeah, I think that's kind of the same question. So the ratio in the gear case stays the same. I think it's 17-15. It's a 1-1-3. That ratio is fixed. It's the same ratio that's always been there. What can change is the ratio in the overdrive. So the overdrive, and it can't change on the fly. It's a fixed ratio. But we have, I think, 7 different ratios designed that work in that overdrive. So the overdrive is basically a spur gear set. If you've ever, if you go out to the Mercury Racing website and you click on the page for the 360, there's a cross-section view of the midsection and it shows the overdrive in there. But it's basically just a spur gear set. So you have the input shaft coming down and a spur gear, second spur gear behind it. We'll slide my little hand images over here. And then the output shaft comes off of the aft gear. So there's a couple of different ratios. Like I said, there's 6 or 7 different ratios we designed for the front gear to the rear gear that basically spans prop shaft speeds above where the current engines are to below where the current engines are. Because we really wanted to have, we didn't quite know where we wanted to shoot for, so we wanted to design a range in there so that people could play with it and try and dial it in to whatever the right ratio would be for their application. And even if you had a short course versus a long course, I could see running different ratios too. But the overdrive unit, it's all self-contained. So basically, if you drop the gear case off the engine, there's 4 nuts that hold the overdrive unit up to the drive shaft housing, and then there's a little water tube attached with a single 6mm fastener and a crow's foot. So you take the water tube off, take those 4 nuts off, pull the overdrive out, put another one in. It's really no more time than changing a gear case.
Interesting. So Andrew chimed in again. Any plans to make improvements to the 360 APX collaboration hardware to make it more competitive compared to the 2-stroke from a cold start whole shot during a modified Le Mans start?
Yeah, that's one of the big challenges is, you get this S3000, the 2-stroke, that when you shut it down and you go hit the start key, I mean, it fires like that. It's amazing how quick those things fire off.
Mm-hmm.
The 4-stroke doesn't, it just doesn't fire that quickly. Part of it is with the modern ECU control, you have an encoder on the flywheel. The flywheel's got to turn a certain amount of distance or a certain amount of revolutions before the encoder figures out where it is and when it needs to fire the ignition coils and all that kind of stuff. That said, we did spend a lot of time on calibration to try and make the start as quick as possible. We did put a 24-volt start on the engine to try and spin it a little bit faster. So it is not as fast, from button to fire as the 2-stroke. That is, that's just a target that we weren't able to get to. But it's about as quick as we think we can make it. The other thing we did was we use a low inertia flywheel. So the flywheel that we put on the engine is about half the mass of the production flywheel. So that helps get it spun up faster too. So once it fires, it accelerates probably about as fast as the 2-stroke does. But yeah, that first fire is not quite as quick as the 2-stroke.
Yeah. And I know the Optis had that same problem getting off the dock.
Yeah. And in fact, one of the complaints that we had gotten about the Optimax wasn't necessarily the start time, but it was the inconsistency in start time. That one time it fires really quickly and then the next time you're cranking all day long. So that was actually something we wanted to shoot for was, we know it's going to be a little bit longer, but we do want it to be very consistent so that the driver can predict exactly when it's going to fire. So, and we think we achieved that. We think it's very consistent, but it is not quite as quick as the S3000.
I got a question from Brent Dillard. We kind of answered it, but it really hasn't been answered yet. We won't know until it actually races. He said, will the new APX motor beat an S3000 motor in F1 H2O for 45 laps. I was like, well, that's what your plan is.
That's the $64,000 question, right? We haven't run them head to head.
I think it's going to be lap times. Correct.
I think it's equivalent lap times. It's faster at the end of the straightaway. So, I mean, you can imagine a scenario if you've got a drag race. If you're 10 miles an hour faster at the straightaway, you're going to get in front of the other boat. And now the other boat's got to get in front of you, right? The other boat's got to get around you. I don't have a crystal ball. I can't say what's going to happen the first time they're going to go head to head. But, the other thing I would point out, and something we haven't really talked about, is one of the major improvements that teams are going to see when they go from the current 2-strokes to the 4-stroke is durability.
Yeah.
This engine is much more durable than the current engines. And we talked about this the other day, Dana. I looked at DNF rates for F1 H2O compared to like F1 cars or MotoGP.
Mm-hmm.
They are twice as high in F1 H2O. So basically you have twice as much chance of not finishing a race in F1 H2O right now as you do in other kind of top level motorsports. And a lot of that is it's engine issues. And it's not just, big engine failures like putting a rod out the side. It's a lot of electrical stuff. They're just not as durable and reliable. The 360, we designed that to run, guys are going to be able to run multiple seasons on that engine without touching it. So I think you're going to see a lot more people getting to the finish line than you do today. So that's going to be a wild card too. I think if you're a racer and you're trying to decide, are you going to run the 2-stroke or the 4-stroke? 4-stroke's got a lot better chance of bringing you to the finish line than the 2-stroke does. So, it's kind of that old saying to finish first, you must first finish, right?
Exactly.
So I think that's another aspect of the performance that is going to be important to factor in.
What's the go-to-market for the strategy of the motor in F1 H2O? And I'll preface that question with, like, for instance, IndyCar, you have a lease program, you lease a motor from Honda or Chevy. NASCAR, you go to Joe Gibbs Racing or RCR and you lease a motor from them. They're relying on that. Are you going to have a lease motor program? Are you going to have staff there, or is it a sealed motor? What's sort of the plan?
So it's not a lease; it's a sale. It can be purchased through I think any Mercury racing dealer. As far as support and there's a couple questions there. So support, we have Mercury Racing staff that will be on site supporting the races. So as soon as they're running the new engine, we're going to have people there. They'll probably be a bit of a mix between our European staff and the staff out of Fond du Lac, and we'll kind of play that by ear and balance that as the seasons go on. It's very similar to how we support the XCAT series overseas. Okay. So we have Mercury Racing on staff on site at every XCAT race. So it'll be a similar kind of model there. It will be a sealed engine from the factory. So we'll seal a couple of key points on the engine. And that's really, there's two pieces of that whole sealed engine strategy, which that's obviously different for F1 H2O. Part of it is trying to assure parity and that people aren't modifying engines and getting an unfair advantage. The other part of it is thinking about it from the perspective of scrutineering after a race. A 2-stroke, it is so simple to pop the heads off of a 2-stroke, measure chamber volumes, measure port heights. You can do that in, a good scrutineer can be doing that in 10 minutes. The 4-stroke is much more involved. Getting the cylinder heads off the engine it's an hour before you've got the heads off. It's a big task. So it's just not as practical to scrutineer those engines like you do a 2-stroke today. So that's the other thing we've tried to be mindful of is how do people scrutineer and make sure that the engines are not tampered with, and that they've got a level competition between all the teams. And again, that's something we do in XCAT today with the 400 ROS. Those are sealed engines, and we've worked out systems with the UIM to do that. So we'll try that same approach here with F1. Obviously, it's new to them and it's new to us too. So we'll be flexible. If we find out some things of our plan are just not working correctly, we'll have to adapt that. The other thing is we're working on coming up with some new tools for them to use to check the ECUs and make sure that those haven't been tampered with, because that's always the boogeyman. It's this black box and you have no idea what's inside of there, if somebody's messed with it. So we're trying to make it easy for them to be able to check that too. So I think we've got some new tools that will be helping them with as well.
Excellent. We got the questions are starting to flow in, which I love it. Let's see. I'll select this. Well, let's go back. So let me ask you. Jim Robb asked this question: will the APX run against the S3000? And how long do you think the APX is just going to take over? Is there a phase-in period? Do you think there's going to be a phase-in period, or do you think all the teams are just going to take on the program?
That's a really good question. And there isn't a hard answer to that right now. So part of the answer is we have all of the rules and the homologation done. So the engine is homologated with UIM. The rules have been updated for F1. So by the letter of the law, it is legal to run now. What isn't really clear and has always been the big question from anybody who's racing the boats today is obviously the four-stroke's heavier. It's a bunch heavier. It's 50 kilos heavier than the current engine. It's about 110 pounds heavier than the current engine. That's a big deal, right? I mean, it's a 1,000-pound boat or a little over a 1,000-pound boat. So the big question is, how much does my boat have to change to work with this four-stroke? And that there's a spectrum of answers there, from your current boat's just fine to go run it, to I got to throw away my current boat and I got to start over and start with something totally new. And so the amount of change required to the boat to make the new engine work really factors into that question of, does everybody just run whatever they want to and swap back and forth? Or do we have to make a hard change at, like, this season is two-stroke and next season is four-stroke? That hasn't been determined. And we've always, in our conversations with F1 H2O and UIM, we've always said, you guys have to go test this thing and you have to tell us what you think. Mercury's not going to dictate that to you. Yeah. Our experience is limited to two boats right now. We've run on Chris's boat and we've run on the boat that we bought, the 2009 DAC. Both of those boats, we put the engine on, and within a couple of days we were there. So our opinion is that the boats probably don't need major changes. Might need to play around with ballasting, maybe play around with setback. But I think very quickly they're going to be competitive with their current boats. Now, they're obviously not optimized. The boats are optimized for the two-stroke. So as people learn and as they get smarter, as they start tweaking the hulls and to take advantage of it, they're only going to get faster. So certainly the boats are going to change over time. I think the question really in their minds, when I say their F1 H2O, is whether their current boats are going to work or not. And like we were talking about before we started, I can say, yeah, it'll be fine. Go ahead and run it. But who am I? I'm just the engine guy. They got to get it on the boats. They got to believe that or not believe that for themselves. So I think they could probably run side by side. I think they could be competitive right out of the gate, but that's going to be the series decision to make, not ours.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a series and a team decision, budget wise. Because when I worked for the Overton's race team that was developed in Springfield, Ohio, we ran through the same challenges. We were in the cusp of introducing the S3000 and moving away from the 2-liter, which the 2-liter was very high RPM, huge cost, maintenance, everything. The S3000 was, a little heavier motor, and, it took us a while to develop it. We did a lot of testing. As soon as we won a race, boom, everybody was switching. Everybody was starting to look at it. So it's a matter of performance in any racing. So get it out there. We got some more questions chiming in. I think we've got the question as like, how much are these going to cost? And does a team need like 50 of these as backup? I use that as a number, because every team's got to have a backup, because for sure. There is unsure. There is reliability in this, but if you're performing and you have to compete and you have to satisfy a sponsor, great that you're there helping, but if you torch a motor or something, you got to have a backup. It's just it's nature of the beast.
Yeah, of course. I mean, you got to be prepared for that, right?
Yep.
So our price for a complete engine is $55,000 to the racer. So, and I know there's sticker shock, right? I mean, it's a big number. But when we've done the math and we've got a pretty good idea of what at least an F1 H2O those teams are paying, most the top teams are rebuilding power heads after every race. The teams that are trying to squeak by on a smaller budget, they're probably going every other. But they're really rolling the dice, and they're probably tuning the engine back a little bit to try and get 2 races out of it. And so we've got a pretty good idea of what they're paying to rebuild an engine. So if you've got a 6-race season, and you're paying what we think the teams are paying to rebuild power heads after every single race, the value equation for the V8, it comes out that it's going to pay for itself in a season, maybe, certainly within 2 seasons.
Excellent. I think the other standpoint of that cost, it is a little bit of sticker shock, but you also have to relate it to number of races too. So I kind of blame it. I take some responsibility to that too. Is like if we were to introduce the new motor into, say, Champions Park Lake or within the States, we need more races for these guys to justify to spend that money. So they can run a whole season on a V6 or whatever, or run 2 seasons without touching it. But if they have multiple races, they have an opportunity to make money, or not make money, but, cover the cost and things like that.
Yep. The economics are, it's always a challenge, right? The other part of it with the new engine is all the service parts. You have to think about like coils and starters and alternators. It's all common. Any Mercury dealer can sell that to you right now. They've all got it on their shelf. So you're not trying to scrounge up, stators and voltage regulators from, behind some dealership because they've got some junked old 2-stroke sitting in the back, and you might be able to scavenge something there. I think that's going to be another piece of the equation too, is that just servicing the engines is going to be a lot easier, and not as touch and go as it is with the current engines.
Got it. And I had a question earlier from David, and I wanted to dive into this because you guys are kind of helping out in this project, the F4 project for the U.S. Chris Fairchild, David McMurray, John Eddy, Brad Collins, Fairchild are kind of helping build this new mold for an F4. Dave asked, is there any consideration of making a short midsection and racing foot for the 60 horsepower 4-stroke?
So we've got the Formula Race engine, we call it. So it's a 60 horse 4-cylinder power head, 15-inch mid with wing plates. That's basically the power for the Formula 4 series over in Europe now. And they've been running that for a couple of years. That engine's been out for a while now. It's about due for a refresh, so we are looking at that and seeing what opportunity might be there. And obviously that kind of lines up with that project that you just mentioned. So we'll have to see how that goes.
I'm excited about that project because Chris and I have talked. We want to get it's a great starter piece for someone to get into a tunnel boat. And Chris and I we always talk about APBA. How do we get our replacements into the sport? How do we get the next Chris Fairchild? How do we get the next Rusty Wyatt and things like that, drivers into the sport? And I look at that F4 as a great way, a great starter piece. And I know David McMurray, Nashville Marine, is really pushing for that piece to get going. And I'm excited that you guys are a part of that because I think that can help get the new generation into the racing.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, obviously, we're talking about the stuff at the high end where it's a lot of dollars, and there's not a lot of people who can play in that space. But if you talk about, the more entry level where, youth kids are getting into tunnel boat racing, that top end of the pyramid's not going to be there unless people are coming in at the bottom to continuously, replenish. So if there's ways that we can help with that, that'll be pretty exciting.
Plus, I look at it as an opportunity to get new mechanics for dealerships because they're starting to work on 4-cycle stuff instead of the 2 cycles. Because your dealers, which we know a lot of the dealers, they're just working on 4-cycle stuff. And to get a kid in there to learn 2-cycle, it doesn't really help them on their daily business. So we've got more questions coming in. Feel free to bring them in, guys. I have one question, and I'm surprised it hasn't been asked. So what happens when someone dumps this motor into salt water?
Yeah. Well, Chris will tell you, we've already figured out what happens when one gets wet. he was kind enough to help us with that. So, if it's fresh water, it's really not that big a deal. We did come up with a dry out procedure. We already kind of had something in place for production 4-strokes, because I've seen it happen with production stuff. A boat goes under for whatever reason, and people have salvaged motors back up, and you dry them out and you clean up, a couple of things and make sure the key is always with the engine, at least, is to get it running as quickly as possible, because you get those iron cylinder liners. Once they get wet and you wash the oil off, they're going to rust pretty fast unless you get that engine running again. Salt water, the trick with salt water is it's just nasty on electrical parts. It gets into everything.
Yeah.
So really the extra challenge with salt water is you really got to change the wire harness. You got to go through the electronics and all the electrical components, and maybe you try to save a buck and not replace everything, but man, electrical problems after an engine's been in salt water are just a bear to chase. So probably if one goes under in salt water, you're just better off putting a new harness on it, change out the electrical parts, and move on. If you can get the engine refired again, the power head will be fine. If you can fire it up quickly and keep any rust from forming inside the engine, that's not a big deal. It's the electrical stuff that just hates salt water, and you try to seal it as best you can, but that stuff's nasty. It just gets into everything.
Do you guys envision, I mean, this has been a big project, and it's kind of like, you saw the evolution of S3000. Do you see this going into markets like drag boats and STVs and kind of that consumer side? Do you envision like race on Sunday, sell on Monday type thing?
We're getting all kinds of requests from all different corners of powerboat racing. It might be offshore, it might be drag, might be, whatever, the little kneel down stuff. People are really hungry for new product from Mercury Racing to re-engage. And so we know that there's a lot of interest in there. So I do think we're going to see that the V8 platform start to evolve into these other areas. I think there's a lot of opportunities there. And for Mercury Racing, obviously Mercury Racing today is not the Mercury Racing it was 20 years ago. We're really focused on these high-end consumer products now. That's truthfully, that's what makes the money, and that's what pays for us to go play in the competition space. So when we do products like the 450R, that's what funds us working on the 360 Apex, or the 60 horse project, or other things that we're talking about. So for us, it's a balance of keeping the consumer stuff rolling and keeping that going, but then also picking which projects to work on. And the problem we have is we have way more projects in the hopper than we have bandwidth to go do. So we have to be pretty selective about what we go work on next. But we're going to try and keep a balance, over the next few years of consumer stuff, and then trying to keep the competition stuff moving too. That's the goal, and I hope we are successful in doing that.
I have this is probably one of my last questions, but feel free, guys, to chime in and ask questions for Jeff. We've got we'll probably go on another 10 minutes. So, would you guys welcome competition in the 4-cycle realm?
Yeah, competition. Think about it. My background's in the consumer space, more the mainline stuff. And so in the outboard world, it's Mercury and Yamaha, right? Like we're kind of pretty close in market share and very similar product lines. And if you look at what's happened with our two companies in the last 20 years, it's just innovation after innovation after innovation, right? And each company raises the bar for the other one, and so we just have this competition, and the consumer wins, right? The products are better and better and better, and consumer benefits. So you can make the same argument for racing, that if another competitor comes in, then we have to up our game, and it's a back and forth. And I think as long in the competition world, as long as you can do that without letting the costs get out of control, that can be healthy. But I think we've seen in a lot of different competition spaces, if the cost gets out of control, that's not good for the sport either. So I'd be very interested to see if somebody else would come in to the competition space and challenge us. I don't see it personally on the horizon. I don't see that any other companies really have the stomach for it. Because it's not just an engine, it's everything. It's the midsection, it's the cowling, it's the gear case. There's a lot of investment there for really small volume. And so companies that don't.
Yeah, you've got Mercury Racing. There's a culture there too.
I was going to say, exactly. So for companies that don't have this, where it is what we do, it's who we're about, it's where we started, and it's in our DNA. For somebody to come in from the outside and make that kind of investment, I'm not going to say never, I'll never say never, right? But it seems a little unlikely, but you never know.
I've seen a couple of videos, and the sound of it is pretty interesting. I kind of like it because I've been around car racing and stuff. What was the feedback from the drivers on the different sound of these motors?
Yeah, it's interesting. And from the drivers, when the guys are in the boat, it's very different. And I think they have a hard time initially calibrating themselves to it because the RPMs are much lower, right? So the engine RPM, we turn the V8 up to 7,000 RPM. Well, you're turning an F1 engine up to 9,600 or more. So there's that oral input of what the engine's doing is way different, and that takes some recalibration. But I think if you ask Chris, for example, or Mike, they got used to it, and they could start picking it up, and the cues are there. It just took them a little while to get used to it. I will say from the outside, it sounds badass. It sounds really good. It's an open exhaust V8. It sounds really good. So I'm really excited for people to experience that side of it, because that was something going into it. A lot of people are like, man, it's a 4-stroke. It's going to be too quiet. It's just going to sound like a sewing machine. It's not going to be cool. No, it's not that at all. It's really good.
It's kind of like when IndyCar transitioned from the turbos to IndyCar went to the big V8s, and you could hear the difference.
No, they sound really good. I'm excited about that side of it.
Excellent. Well, guys, we're wrapping up here. Feel free to chime in any last minute questions. I'm trying to think of any others that I have here. Hopefully, Jeff, you can make it down to Champions Park Lake this year for the OPC Nationals and also the Stock Mon Nationals. We'd love to have you down there.
Yeah, I've been. I made it a goal of mine in my first year or so at Mercury at Mercury Racing, to start getting out and seeing all the different forms of racing that we're involved in. And so I got down to I've been to Michigan City races a couple of times now. I've been down to Key West. Been to a few races in Europe, XCAT, Class 3, F1. Yeah. But there's so much, and it all got clamped down last year. So I'm hoping to get back in the saddle this year and start getting out and seeing some more.
Yeah, would love to have you down. You could see a little bit of history, because we got the Wizard down in Springfield, Ohio. I'd love to. It's under restoration, so Bill Chatfield, you need to get working on that. So.
It's a really cool piece of Mercury racing history there.
Yeah, exactly. We did have one last question. I think you answered it before, but David Radcliffe, we'll see if he'll bring it up again. What happens when it gets wet? You drive out like any other motor.
Pretty much, with a 4-stroke, so you got to drain the oil out. You got to get the water out of it and put fresh oil in it, and fire it back up as quickly as you can. Get it hot, drive the water off, and away you go.
Oh, we've got Andrew Graguch again. Any advice for early adopters drawing from lessons learned from the 2-stroke to four-stroke transition that was done in MotoGP and motocross 2 decades ago.
That's a really interesting parallel, right? I mean, I think
Yeah.
those are really good examples of other series where said, no freaking way. There's no way a four-stroke's ever going to work in this, especially motocross, right?
Yeah.
These things are flying all over the place. There's no way. Well, they figured it out, right? I mean, I think give it time. People running the engine will figure it out. And, a part of it too, we didn't really talk about a lot is the motivation for F1 H2O and UIM in large part is they need to move to green technology. And I know a lot of people in the racing world don't like talking about that. They're like, they think that it's really not relevant. And, you could argue that it's not relevant to the competition, but it's really relevant to sponsors. It's really relevant to venues trying to put on races.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that they're running, high emissions, dirty engines, old technology engines, that becomes a big barrier for them to put on events in certain places and for them to attract sponsors.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that other aspect, and Dana, you're involved in the sponsorship side. You know
Oh,
this better than I do, that there are certain parts of this, the S3000s and the old race engines, emissions and fuel economy, that wasn't a consideration. That wasn't something they were designed for, and that just wasn't required. But
yeah.
it is today. I mean, the landscape has changed. So, having an engine that can meet 3-star emissions, and that is, we've seen something like 35% lower fuel burn with the V8 compared to the S3000 in a race cycle.
Mm-hmm.
That's a big deal for them now, and that's something that's really important for them. If you go to F1H2O's website, I mean, they've got links in there for how they're doing carbon offsets, and
Mm-hmm.
UIM makes a big deal about environmental factors. They run the solar races,
Mm-hmm.
um, and you're involved in that too.
Yep.
So it's become a part of motorsports, and I know not everybody's excited about that, but it is the reality. So I think that's
I
another
think
point.
people aren't excited about it, but like for instance, we had renewable lubes at our event last year, and they've developed high performance oil off of renewable soybeans, and they do really well. The performance on the oil is great, and it's biodegradable. It's safe for the environment. So
Mhm.
I think we can be good stewards. I was actually talking to a company today that recycles plastics and turns it into crude, and they're making methanol race fuel now out of
Yeah.
it. So, and they're taking any dirty plastic. So, I think we're all engineers, and we can always find a better way. And it's always good to be good stewards because we run into that of putting on community events.
Mhm.
When you go into a city, it's the first question out of their mouth. Is like, what do you run? What kind of motors are you running? What are you going to tear up in our river and things like that? So I think it's a good segue, and I think it's gonna help boat racing in the long run, and I think we're excited to have Mercury involved. We're getting some last minute questions in. Everybody want to throw them in. Jim Slack, when do you think there will be an F2 version of the new APX? When that'll be the V6 version, correct?
Well, that would be a logical conclusion to draw.
Exactly. Are you able to answer when you said? I think you said something like a couple months. You're going to release something.
Yeah. So the challenge, the challenge with the last year has been, typically we release products in concert with boat shows.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the boat shows, they get planned and then they get canceled, and they get planned and they get canceled.
Mm-hmm.
So launching new products has been a little bit of a game of
Yeah.
whack-a-mole, trying to figure out exactly what the right timing and venue and all that sort of thing is. So we're still trying to get our heads around that, but I think you're going to see something that's more focused at the U.S. market, and the next step down from F1 in the next few months.
Our buddy Mike Makus chimed in. 4-stroke versus 2-stroke performance on full fuel load versus end of the race fuel load. I assume you're going to run less fuel for the
Yeah. So
efficiency on this.
yep. So, if you figure we're going to burn 35% less fuel in the course of a race, well, then obviously you don't need to bring that fuel along with you
Mm-hmm.
if you're just going to leave it in the tank. So yeah, they can certainly run less fuel load based on the length of the race, um, and then how the boat behaves with a full tank versus an empty tank. That's a bit of a balance thing with the V8 and the boats we've run so far. I think they tend to handle a little better with the full tank just because it balances the boat a little bit better. But it is ultimately faster with less fuel load. So, that's something that I imagine would be kind of dialed in and optimized as somebody goes and develops a boat specifically for the V8.
Got it. Excellent. Well, Jeff, thanks for coming on the show. I'm going to throw it to you. Is there anybody that you would like to thank? I always throw that to my guests. Anybody you like to thank, sponsors, vendors in this crazy project or projects that you've been doing? Because you guys aren't just doing the V8. You've got a V6 going. You've got the force, the F460. Then you've also got the 20 horse in stock. So it's really exciting to see you guys back in outboard racing with the smaller classes and stuff. So anybody you would like to thank?
Yeah, I mean, we got a lot of irons in the fire, which is it can be stressful, but it's a lot of fun too. It is really cool. My team at Mercury Racing, we're a really small team, but I mean, just guys who are super passionate about what they do. There's a really cool mix of younger engineers and then guys who have been around tunnel boat racing for ages. And I think a lot of the folks watching this video know guys like Murr and Charlie, who've been involved in this stuff for forever. And then outside of Mercury, I mean, Chris Fairchild, Fred Hollenstein, I mean, those guys have been just invaluable. There's so much of their input in these new engines. Can't thank those guys enough for everything they've done for us. And even more broadly, APBA, all the folks I've talked to in APBA, in the UIM and F1H2O, to a person, they're all really excited to be engaged, to see Mercury Racing as involved as we are now. It's been really cool, and really looking forward to developing those relationships and continuing the momentum that we've started here.
Excellent. Well, thanks for coming on the show, Jeff. We'll see.
Thanks for having me.
Like I said, you're more than welcome to come to Springfield, Ohio to watch some outboard racing this year. We
Sounds
will
good.
be racing. So have a great evening. Folks, we're going to have next week's show is going to be hosted by K-Dub. She is going to have the legendary Jake Alkema on. He's going to talk about his program for 2021 and getting ready for the season. I think he's got some new equipment on the way. So tune in next Thursday at 8 p.m. Central. And thanks for joining in. And hopefully we were able to answer everybody's questions, and everybody have a good night. And don't forget to go to getbesser.com and get your immune system booster. Thanks. Take care. Have a great night.